also just and usually catch it later. I have a couple to upload, but I'm hoping, unlike last semester, you'll see those in a little bit more of a real-time fashion. So hopefully if you miss class, you'll be able to see the recording within roughly a week of the class occurring. Cool. Just a little bit of shop talk to start us up. Now we did have a quiz today, so we're starting on borrowed time. I think just for kind of wonder, I think for the sake of today, we might forego attendance, which means if you're on Zoom and I just marked you present, I'm going to go later and unmark it. It doesn't show on your end, but it'll just be a wash for everyone because I want to jump in. And we do have less than an hour. Now, let's screen share. You guys are seeing hopefully screen two. Are you? No, you're not. Here we go. Now you're seeing it. Okay. So what are we doing today? Today is class 6. We are imminently, as of next week, well, I've got a couple more readings in this line of thought, but we've almost finished our foundational theory unit where, like I keep saying, if you think I'm beating a dead horse, it's only because these things are going to keep coming up, but they're going to look different. They're going to feel different. And they're actually, more often than not, right now, we're looking really big picture. And then in the rest of the weeks, we're going to zoom in and look at different layers and different components of what we cover in these weeks. But when you're trying to theorize and in your own work, describe, document, synthesize, hopefully these will be some of the tools that you're using. Now, last time we finished our culture group presentations. We are going to today catch up on a bulk of the readings from this week. But if you'll remember, today was our first quiz, right? This week you will see the midterm posted tomorrow. So we'll go over it together next week in class a little. So if the first time you see it is when we pull it up on the board next week, totally fine. But if you get curious, you will see a notification and I will upload that on to the announcements as well. I also figured out how to make assignments without having them dog us for eternity. And if anyone has ever been in a situation where a professor forgot to publish the assignment and it sucked, this is the reverse. I can make it and just not publish it. So a win is a win. Now, if you're not looking ahead, which is totally fine, I just want to earmark it on the horizon. Next week, there's no class on Thursday. So Tuesday, when we come together, we're going to kind of take anything left from this first couple of weeks just to bring it all together with our Sharkey readings. So sticky places is where we will leave it. And we'll regroup on all that next week. But with that, we're going to go ahead and jump in. And if I'm not mistaken, yeah, no, today, I'm not gonna lie, today's a lot of talking at you. But if we have a chance, I will share a video at the end. Now, does anyone have any announcements or questions for the good of the group? Anything cool going on? Please.
Garden service event next Friday. I know it's Valentine's Day, but if y'all want to give love to the community, good morning with the weather. I'll start the flyer next week.
Please do. Is there still an herb garden? Do you know?
Yeah. I only know about the garden here.
Yeah.
And the orchard.
Yeah, the little garden here. They did a Thanksgiving thing a couple years back, and I got like 3 months worth of herbs. And yeah, not to be like, I think those are free herbs. And if you don't know about herbs, if you don't trim them, they stop being their beautiful selves. So if you're needing any mint, I can hook you up. But cool. Please do send the flyer. I know there was an event this week. How did the mini pancakes go? Does anyone know? Anyone go have a mini pancake? I'm so happy because I'm pretty sure Thursday or Tuesday it was raining cats and dogs because I was driving in it and it was awful. Yesterday was like a sick head trip, at least on the drive, because it was crazy sunny. So if that's how it was here, weird head trip. And here we're back to where it was. So I don't want to be like, I have that power, but I thought if I had to drive yesterday in that rain, I didn't know what was going to happen. So we got a solid, but that also meant mini pancakes wasn't rained out, hopefully. And I hope if you're on Zoom, I can't remember who announced that, but I'm hoping that event went really, really well. If only because when it goes well, they do it again. Go ahead. Okay. There you go. I just today picked a beef with campus. I do that often, but I want to know why the overhangs aren't actually roofs. Why do they just drip on me? Why are they there? That's it. And it's weird because I never noticed they weren't roofs till today when I went to run under their safety and just was dripped on. Yeah. And I went to school where we were at Dartmouth, it snowed and they didn't give a fuck about snow days because they had these, it was actually really nice. I realized we were quite fortunate that as soon as a snowflake even fucking kissed the ground, there were these itty bitty little bobcat snowplows about as big as a golf cart, and they'd be out plowing all the places we would walk. But that also meant you had to go to class still, no matter what. And here we didn't have tunnels. Some schools have tunnels when you have snow, or at least indoor places to get from one building to the other. And our school made most of an overhang. Uh, yeah, that's it. Now, like I said, we're jumping in today. Generally speaking, I don't like these days where I'm the only one talking. It is so quiet in here. But I trust that's because you're listening a little at least. But where do we bring it all back together? Now, we've spent the last couple of days talking quite a bit about culture in the different ways we see it in our lives, also as it relates to the issues we'll be studying all semester. But we know that culture obviously isn't just for the study of poverty, unemployment, and crime. Culture is for so much more than that. But as it relates to this specific inquiry, I want to bring this. We've seen this slide before, and I kind of highlighted a handful of things a little differently this time. If we think of urban inequality, at least in present day, now as an enterprise largely focused on trying to explain the differences across cities, both within them and across between cities, trying to explain it as a function of community conditions or community factors rather than individual choices. If this is the enterprise, we know that there is this early genesis where deindustrialization and the unemployment that was almost immediate and widespread, we see huge implications in that very first generation where it happens. But over time, we see other things start to contribute, whether that is crime that was already existing and now increases, whether that's poverty that was already there and also increases. It's having a fit. Don't do me like that. We're 6 days in. I was hoping we were gonna, there we go. Okay. You never, I was like, if you know my class, I don't even want to say it out loud, but we've been doing real good on tech. And this room wasn't always like that. Back to it. We know that at one point there was very much a causal process occurring where one thing happened, X causes Y, right? Or at least we were expecting that the huge loss of jobs had this very immediate impact, tangibly speaking, on lives and cities, neighborhoods, et cetera. But over time, with multiple generations and different people, different processes occurring, there almost ends up being this like vicious cycle or negative feedback loop, where the thing that originally started it is, yes, still very much occurring, but the things that it may have prompted or worsened are now contributing to that original problem. And it's like, well, where the fuck do you even cut in? Where do you intervene? That is very much a subject we'll return to throughout the class. But at minimum, before we got to intervening, we at least need to have a sense of things. So if we're trying to explain violent crime, we're stepping back from that really negative academic tradition of focusing on values to highlight instead the role of structure and culture in shaping behavior. Now, I do think it's important to say that we as sociologists might be unique, that we are trying to bring the emphasis elsewhere, because there are other disciplines that probably still place things and the emphasis, the locus of action on the individual, on the choices they make, and the economic rationale they deduce in their own heads. That being said, I think we are social beings, and very rarely do we ever have an idea that's completely our own. That's, I don't want to be like, you're young, you'll see it soon. Give it a decade. You'll be like, shit. They're doing what I did, thinking they did it. I just heard Britney Spears, I'm a Slave for You, cut into a song. It's sick. It's a good song. I need to find it. But I was like, there's some kid somewhere thinking that's the first time that song ever sounded like that. But if we think of humans as also building on this, the things we see, what we're exposed to, the communities we live in, drastically shape our outcomes. And we know that that's actually persistent over time. Now, bringing it specifically back to the More Than Just Race book, we can think of this, right, again, as something that is canvassing years and years of information. And what they have discovered is that the ongoing lack of success in the labor market, if we think of this as a first domino of sorts, whether that's ranging from outright unemployment to being trapped in menial jobs, which also counts, that leads to a lessening of self-confidence and eventually to feelings of resignation that frequently result in temporary or even permanent abandonment of looking for work. Now, obviously, we know that this isn't the case for everyone, but we are trying to explain things happening at that level above the individual, because whether or not any one person has this happen to them, that does not explain the huge social patterns we're seeing. Now, they essentially boil it down to a process whereby the role of schools and educational attainment, either as a result of poor school quality, poor teacher quality, dropping out, even the cognitive abilities that can be shaped by your impact before you even get to the school, those kinds of, if we think of a snowball, right? Whether it's positive or negative, that I think it's what one of Newton's laws, right? The energy, it just keeps, snowball, shit rolls downhill. I think Newton said it best. That's the exact way the law is, I'm sure. But if this is the starting point, we can think of ways we also accrue things over the life course, whether that is increasing crime and illicit industries, right? These are things that are existing in societies where everyone's working too, but when formal employment and all of the social ties that go with that vanish almost overnight, there can't help but be something else to fill that space. And that means often too, if that's the only way to make ends meet, why would you not provide for your family, whether it is legal or illegal, if you have the way to do that? Now, obviously, regardless of the intent or even the impact, because we know that drugs in particular, right, that's not positive usually on a community. Keeping that layer out, we know that these communities, as the crime and the illicit activities might be increasing for a variety of reasons, we're also seeing it lead to mass incarceration because these places are hyper surveilled. They are constantly under surveillance and they are subjected to levels of policing that aren't experienced elsewhere. And so then it's like, well, do these places actually have more crime, or do they just have more cops and more people catching people doing things wrong? Now, does this seem like something that only happens in the city? Can I ask you guys? Why might it be different in a city though? Like imagine, we had a bad, I don't want to name names. Atwater's got a prison. I like Atwater, let it be known. But if you were looking at it demographically speaking, having a federal prison in your census tract might be associated, one could say, with negative things. But why would that work differently than if you were in a city? What's kind of the difference in those places? And it's the difference in the place fundamentally, but how is it impacting what you're exposed to? Think about it. Do I get to see Atwater a lot? Like if I'm not in Atwater, does it really matter what's happening to me? What if I was over, I don't know if you guys know Atwater well, but if I was at the shopping center, if I was at the Target, does it matter what's going on at the prison? It doesn't. But if you're in a community where your neighborhood is a block or 2 blocks or 3 blocks, you can see where that concentration occurs. If you think of the lake drying up or a creek bed, that last little bit, that's where all those kind of negative things also just, that's often what's left in the concentration. But we can't absolve the system because we know that these places were designed as such in some ways, and they were only effective when work was available. But in some ways, when we think about redlining, these were never places designed for anyone to thrive. It was instead by the extreme resilience and tenacity of the people who lived there that was the case. But arguably, they were already places designed for surveillance and for concentrating groups of people away from others. And now, if we have mass incarceration enter the chat, you have the mark of a criminal record, which means it's a landmark study where they showed how the prevalence of mass incarceration in the United States and the frequency by which people might have a felony or a misdemeanor was so overly assumed to be racial in nature that it didn't matter whether you were a Black man who had never been to prison, who had a college degree, et cetera. It was assumed that you had. And so if we were in a slack labor market, they actually would send people out. They matched them. They had two people with the exact same resume down to the name and sent them out to apply to jobs. The only thing that was different was that they had indicated on their application that they had a felony conviction and the race of the auditor. That's what they would call the people who'd go out and be the faux applicant. They showed that actually the penalty of the criminal record was so significant that it was impacting people who had never had that experience in their lives. But it's a process they call statistical discrimination. Has anyone ever heard that term? Why would we make different kind of discriminations? Discrimination is discrimination, right? I was like, I can't remember what the other kind is called besides hate and bigotry. But if we think of our typical discrimination, it's just boilerplate. I don't like you because of X. I don't like all people who are X. So that just is what it is. Statistical discrimination isn't that simple. It's like, oh, it's not that deep. I actually love all people of this category, but statistically speaking, people of this category often have these things happen. So I'm just using the statistics to make an accurate decision that, I might not know your race, but your zip code, I can tell you live over in that part of the city. Statistically speaking, people who live in that part of the city, I've seen it on the news. So that's where we saw it occurring from an employer perspective, because we knew, legally speaking, these things are illegal, but it was still happening and it was still being patterned by race with the mark of a criminal record, further nuancing that. Now, this is something we're absolutely going to be coming back to because we also know that it's not that simple. It's not just a matter of employers discriminating, even though that's a huge part of it. But again, this is where we see there was already a vicious cycle starting, but then you have prisoner reentry, you have high recidivism. What does recidivism mean? Does anyone know? Or even context clues, what could it mean? Go ahead. Reoffending. Excellent. Does anyone know the opposite of recidivism in the fancy word? I didn't know this till I had a PhD, half of it at least. So reoffending and then not offending, right, would probably be the counterpart. Maybe it's something that starts with an R or sounds like it. Fuck no. It's called desistance. Desistance is the percent or process by which people do not reoffend after being incarcerated. By comparison, it's actually highly likely. I want to say it's 2 out of 3 people, because we also know the prison system, incarceration, that becomes a further obstacle and actually a further violence and trauma on those who are exposed to that. Now, this is all stuff we're going to come back to in different weeks and dig deeper into it, because the more than just race is giving you the bird's eye view of decades of culminating research on this. But I wouldn't blame you for calling bullshit on parts of it, because it's like, well, how do they know this? How do they know this to be true? Each layer that we just saw here, the role of schools, increasing crime, whether that is crime as a process, and then prisoner reentry. These are all different weeks that we'll face in the weeks to come. And actually, this syllabus changed a little, so you guys got to read a little bit less than past years. That's why this last couple days have been a lot of lecture, because I still want you guys to still have the tools, even if it's me talking to you and not the reading. So we read most of the chapters of More Than Just Race, but we did not read chapter 4. I highly recommend it, but it is arguably, because of its content matter, it's the most controversial chapter. It remains to this day probably the most controversial area of study when we think of urban inequality, because it looks at the roles of family as institutions and how that may or may not also impact the outcomes we're seeing. I can't think of anything more personal probably than family, parenting, childbirth. Like those are deeply intimate things. And we know, historically speaking, that sociology was terrible at speaking about these things with respect. I think sometimes they still struggle with it, honestly, but it's different, thankfully, and better in present day. But largely speaking, from a theoretical and historical context, there was a lot of blaming the victim. And the enterprise of studying marriage or child rearing or fertility rates, all of these things as like parts of sociology, kind of have to fight back against this tradition of, in many ways, assuming a family should look any kind of way, or that parenting or child rearing should occur in certain ways. So you can understand, kind of like culture other ways, this is where things start to get real landminey, but there has been a lot of powerful work nonetheless. And so we have a couple weeks on this later in the semester, but what it really boils down to is that in communities where we were seeing these huge economic and social changes, they were also associated with co-occurring changes in the way that people were relating to one another. For example, multiple partner fertility. What does this mean? I've put some words up there to describe it, but what would multiple partner fertility imply? I, for example, come from a multiple partner fertility home. I have a half brother. What does that mean? Go ahead. Yes, exactly. Now, obviously, this isn't just like something we just started doing. It's, goes way, way back. But we started seeing it happened more frequently, and it happened in certain ways in certain communities more rapidly than in other places. Because we know, just like across the board, marriage rates for all groups have gone down. Multiple partner fertility rates for all groups have gone up. Why is it that we're seeing it as a negative contributing factor to the outcomes in urban central cities? It is equal parts, right? The changing views on parenthood and marriage, but we also have to remember that, especially in America, the cultural expectation is that people are raising children into two-parent households. And actually, for a bulk of it, we're also assuming that one of them is staying home with the kids and that there's a primary breadwinner. This is not how a lot of families are. And arguably, it was a flaw in our social policy to tie so much of our social welfare provision to having children or to being married. Not to be complaining as a woman with cats, but get ready. How come none of them count as dependents as we get ready to file for the IRS? I grew up, tax time was bitching. It was real Christmas. We had money. I could not wait for them to bring that blue folder home, for real. Now, it's different. I try not to even look at it. April, they're like, where is she? She's coming, right? No, but that is because I obviously have been socially mobile, so that's bitching. But as a single person, you're taxed fundamentally different. And that's when you think of the way we tax things and also the way we incentivize marriage and having children, we do it often through these different policies that we don't even question because that's just how it's always been done. But that's some of those underlying assumptions. Well, it's assuming that in order to receive social welfare, you have to have procreated and you have to be largely in a heteronormative marital arrangement in a nuclear household. this isn't indigenous sociology, but let's just say each of these parts are rife with some settler colonial assumptions about who we are and how we relate to one another. If it was not associated with anything negative, we could leave it at that. But we do see in communities where they're already impacted by these huge constraints across the board that children from low-income households without fathers present. Now, I want to indicate that that's a very specific sentence because it doesn't say that children without fathers present or that children with low-income households. It's actually an interaction where there's something going on when these things go together, such that these children are more likely to be school dropouts, become teenage parents, receive lower earnings in young adulthood, be welfare recipients, and experience cognitive, emotional, and social problems. And as I said, it would be one thing if not having your dad in the home did not impact you in these ways. But it's having a cognitive and emotional, social impact, and it impairs certain skills, certain abilities across the life course that in turn increase your likelihood of dropping out of school, of becoming a teenage parent, of receiving lower earnings across the life course, being on social, on welfare, for example. These are all negative outcomes in and of themselves, right? Now, is marriage the answer? I'm gonna leave that open to the week we come back to that. But would it shock you? Probably not, to know that we've often tried that. That's actually why you see, like I said, the way we tax and we incentivize there being a head of household. That's quite literally incentivizing marriage through social policy. But what about things like domestic violence? Like, is it really something we want to encourage that every person who has a child together be married? I was like, I kind of dumped my purse out a little bit last time when I told you guys about, the safety I felt in certain spaces, but also how I was like, it was both safety, but it was also checking myself. You can't ever get like that, Black George. Put your hands down. It's not that deep. But domestic violence is, I would say, something sociologists don't study. Well, I wish I could say well, but don't study would just be the end of the sentence. And I will come back to this. I want to treat it with the respect that it deserves, but I think when we come back to the weeks on culture and how do we impact multiple partner fertility, how do we impact childhood outcomes, when we talk about marriage as a solution, there's something deeper. Like, there's a deeper process there about intimate relationships and the way people relate to one another, and arguably perhaps the toxic accumulation of generations of negative relationship patterns. But when I wanted to study that for my dissertation many moons ago, I was told by some of the best and brightest, some of whom's books you read or will read, that domestic violence was not a social problem. I'll leave that there because I think you probably know how I feel about it. But nonetheless, the fragmentation of the poor Black family has been included as a component to this. I think because of how difficult it is to talk about and how hard it is to speak on it well, especially, a lot of those ideas have actually fallen out of favor. And in some ways, that's why we skipped this chapter, but I do want to indicate that it is a part of this process. And we do have weeks about it. They kind of talk about it in a more deliberate, intentional way. Now, let's bring this all together though, right? That's the whole point, is what does this mean when we try to combine these things? Because that is really the bravery in the paradigm of the concentrated disadvantage. It's trying to do something that up until that, sociology had struggled to do, to hold space for both things, the structure and the culture, the things that we live in, the rocks, the hard places, but also the choices, the way we move and how it is we know how to move the way we do. Where do these things come from and how do we mediate them? Well, culture in this paradigm or theoretical approach Culture is mediating the impact of structural forces such as racial segregation and poverty. In other words, residents of the ghetto develop ways, often quite creative, to adjust and respond to chronic racial and economic subordination, as reflected in the meaning-making and decision-making processes, including those resulting in the development of informal codes that regulate behavior. Now, in framing public policy, we should not shy away from an explicit discussion of the specific issues of race and poverty. On the contrary, we should highlight them in our attempt to convince the nation that these problems should be seriously confronted and that there is an urgent need to address them. Now, I think if you're in this class, you're probably sold on this part. But when we get to those weeks on policy, and I encourage you just as we take it through the weeks between then, it's like, how much of the outcomes we study that we want to intervene in on positively, usually if we're studying things that are bad, we want things to improve. What are the implicit assumptions I'm already making by the solutions I offer or by the problems I choose to focus on? And not that it's good, bad, or ugly, all different kinds of value-laden things, but instead just to get curious, like a therapist would, of like where and why would I see this solution be possible? Why do I see other solutions? Never in a million years. But then actually, before we even get to the solution, why is it that I've decided to focus here? What is it about this outcome I theorize as negative? Some, might be pretty straightforward, but others, for example, the multiple partner fertility or declining marriage rates, that's something that can be said for the entire country, the entire world. In fact, as women don't have to put up with as much, that's probably just going to keep happening. Stay ready. But it's also demonized in certain communities. And instead of just saying, well, God, what if we didn't hyper surveil these spaces and didn't extract what we could and hadn't done that for generations? Why all of a sudden do I think making these people stay married is going to be the solution to generations of subjugation, marginalization, and extraction? I'm not saying anyone here thinks that, but when we go through the ways we've tried to fix it, or even on the news right now, it's a fucking weird time to be teaching this class, just because I think the ways people view problems and the solutions they offer, you're going to see the things we're talking about in this class. The frames and the narratives we tell ourselves fundamentally shape the world we see and what we dream is possible. I'd like to, I was thinking this when I drew on the board. I've been picking up art for lots of reasons. If anyone knows how to does anyone know how to say this word? First off, I'm going to say it. Don't laugh at me. Don't ever laugh at someone who says a word wrong because you're not an asshole first. But secondly, if they say a word wrong, it's because they've never heard anyone else say it. They only know it from reading it. But it's gouache. Anyone ever heard this word? Gouache. That's right? Okay, I did take French. It sounded fancy, gouache. It's a mix between watercolor and acrylics. TikTok showed me, and the university is quite generous. But I was trying to figure out why I've been so moved to want to, I should be finishing my book if I want to create something, but why have I been seeking out art in different ways? And as I was drawing on the board, a quote that I heard recently, and I think it's prescient as we reflect on culture and policy in real time. It was Queer Man was talking about some of the lessons from the peak of the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s, when it was being ignored by the government and people were losing entire communities overnight, and it wasn't taken seriously. And there are people who lost their lives because of the huge stigmatization of the disease as a whole because of who it was supposed to be associated with. And he talked about a quote he heard that at the height of the AIDS epidemic, in the mornings, we buried our loved ones. In the afternoons, we protested. And by night, we danced. And that it was the ability to keep dancing that allowed them to do those other things. And if you've been in my other class, I try to sprinkle in different things. Dancing, art, these are ways we can play. It looks different when we're adults, but also sometimes it looks a lot the same. We just don't let ourselves do it. But that ability to restore and protect yourself right now through indulging in that play, I think we really need, because we are, what is it? We're only 3 weeks in on Monday. So we got to find some way. And this is the first, I feel like it's early to be feeling this in the semester, but I'm feeling it too. That bone weariness. But why did that relate to class? I was thinking about culture. The things that we even think are possible are so shaped by what we see. And that obviously impacts the way we relate to each other individually, but obviously these huge gears in that macro social level. Now, if we take it to this argument, but in a different form, you actually see one of the earliest theorizations of this concentrated disadvantage paradigm. And why I come back to this, even though by this point it's 30 years old, I was like, no offense to the article, but it turns 30 this year. And Dirty 30 for toward a theory of race, crime, and urban inequality still hits. This is one of the cleanest ways to like come across this info, because I think it galvanizes why is it that we take things that are arguably deeply personal, the study of unemployment and crime and poverty, like these are so intimate and impacting people personally. Why do we try and bring the lens out? Well, the goal of macro level research is not to explain necessarily individual involvement in criminal behavior, but to instead isolate the characteristics of communities, cities, or even societies that lead to high rates of criminality. Now, if we view race and crime, if we view that linkage from a contextual lens, they're highlighting the very different ecological context that Blacks and whites reside in, regardless of individual characteristics. And we have to remember too, sociologists were often speaking to economists. And so the locus of action is placed in very different hands. But in a sociological frame, the basic thesis is that macro social patterns of residential inequality give rise to social isolation and ecological concentration of the truly disadvantaged, which in turn leads to structure barriers and cultural adaptations that undermine social organization and hence the control of crime. So in this, we're trying to hold space for a couple different simultaneous processes or mechanisms that at the end of the day, even though it looks like we are trying to explain something happening at the individual level, we're actually taking it out a little farther. Yes, the individual outcomes are the thing we're trying to explain, but it's not through the emphasis of individual choices, but rather what are the things outside of our control, no matter what we did, that might still predetermine certain outcomes over others. Not in a faded way, perhaps, but rather when we think of things that go together. Both good and bad tend to go together. Now, not together. Birds of a feather. Good goes with good, bad goes with bad. Now, if social isolation, if we're talking about this, and we're going to come back to that concept a lot. It's kind of a biggie. Social isolation is specifically distinguished from the culture of poverty, which is what was the blaming the victim, and we don't fuck with that. It's different by virtue of its focus on adaptations to constraints and opportunities rather than an internalization of norms. Now, what's the difference there? It seems like a very specific phrasing. What are they trying to get at there? What is different from a culture of poverty line of thinking? If we were to look at something like, let's say, multiple partner fertility or not having dad in the home, either one. See if anyone on Zoom. Does it seem like the individual is just picking what they do? They just do what they want? Never. We're sociologists. But instead, it's also not as simple as, we just don't have an individual choice and we don't make choices, because that would be just as false. Instead, it's this idea that you have to adapt to wherever you're born into, that's just the world you know. And so any adaptations therein are a response to the constraints or the opportunities. And it's not just because you want to be a certain way or you value certain things differently. And that is different than when we think of, oh, this neighborhood is like that because, oh, they just don't like working hard. They don't value school. They don't value the same things we value. So that's clearly what's going on there. And I think that this resonates if you come from a background where you know deeply how your personal choices impacted sitting here in this classroom than maybe sitting somewhere else. But you have to, I think, as my tribal judge once said, you can't be mad at someone for not being as strong as you. And I reframe that. You can't blame someone for having a different trauma response. I lucked out that my trauma response was flight, which is paid really well by capitalism. You can work yourself into the ground and be that drug of choice, and no one will ever get mad. No one will ever punish you for that. And I never picked that, but it was an adaptation to a certain circumstance. And so social isolation is this phenomenon of how do we see these really negative outcomes keep occurring, even as people are changing, even as people are saying, I'm going to be different and I'm not going to have that happen to me. Why is it that it still happens? Now, because this is from 30 years ago, I do want to point out that I don't really want to be seeing the word ghetto in the stuff we use. That's not how we say it. It was probably inappropriate to say at the time, even though ghetto is a term from history that was describing a specific phenomenon and concentration or lack thereof of resources or means of production. It is also a word that's been stigmatized heavily. But that's when you read these things, you may have even caught that. Like, I feel they're describing the same thing, but they're talking about it slightly differently. That's actually a reflection of the way this discourse has been refined, and where you had, critical race scholars kind of say, this is a little much the way you guys are speaking about this population. Is there a way to do it without so much bias? Sociologists aren't free from their own bias, but we can also hold space for the kernels that were continuing to be synthesized over time. Now, if we're thinking of this as kind of a circumstance, like how does this happen, social isolation, it comes down to these, if we were going to make a recipe, unfortunately, ecological concentration of poverty, which means physically it's in space in one place and it's part of the very biome. There's racial segregation occurring. There's also residential mobility, in that people are moving out of the neighborhood usually, and there's very little population turnover. So you are either moving out of the neighborhood to get out, or you're never getting out of that circumstance. And very rarely are people moving in to change it. And so much like that creek bed drying up, you see this concentration that impacts over time the ways families are formed. So you see family disruption, and then across the board, dimensions of social organization changing rapidly. Now, this is a different way of saying what we've been talking about this whole time. But I think when you're trying to synthesize, like, what is this as a tool to use long term? It is hard as sociologists, like I say, I think personally, to hold space. I said that 3 times today. I'm tired, guys. I'm sorry. I usually am more mixing it up. Today is therapy though. But if you are a socially mobile person, you know firsthand how your choices impacted how you wound up sitting in a seat at a college, maybe the first in your family to do that, maybe the first people in your neighborhood to do that. You know firsthand how the people you grew up with, you saw choices. Maybe you were hurt by the fact that people moved in ways that made it so they don't get to sit next to you in these classrooms anymore, whether it was at this school or schools like it. So I have always thought as a sociologist, we don't want to sway too far to the extreme of like, oh, people are just products of their circumstance. They don't ever have a chance. They're just, what do you expect of them? Because that's just as bad as saying, oh, they don't value hard work. They don't value education. They don't value partnership and child rearing. Instead, it's digging deeper, like asking the hard question of like, you know what, actually, a lot of these things most people value and would work towards. What are the obstacles preventing them from doing so? And why would the behaviors they are doing make sense? Under what conditions is a phrase Bill, my advisor, would always say that it's hard to make theory. It's just hard. But essentially, what you're trying to do is explain under what conditions do we see a specific outcome? And I think, thankfully, sociology's gotten better at being able to see the world through the eyes of those they study and to make sense of the choices they make in the worlds they live in. And in many ways, it is in part due to the readings from this week and last week to be brave enough to try talking about something that actually had been pretty dicey. And like I said, Bill's written things, not taking anything back, but showing how the term of the underclass became the truly disadvantaged, and then became concentrated disadvantage, inner city, ghetto. These things have fallen out of favor because they had the benefit of being refined by critical scholarship, as well as those from these communities being able to respond and maybe even impact how their communities are studied. Now, it's going to be a bit before we get to see some of those authors, but if you're like, well, what about, like, what do the people in these places actually think? I know it's great to talk about the social part, but what are they actually doing in their head? That'll be for a couple weeks from now. But hopefully you're feeling more comfortable in this concentrated disadvantage paradigm. The big three: unemployment, crime, poverty. Just chant it over and over again like Beetlejuice. But hopefully with an eye towards intervening in these things. So next week, like I said, we'll bring it home with our last piece in this unit, the role of the neighborhood, talking about, what does this look like over time? A lot of the things we were reading were based on deindustrialization, which happened in the 70s, a long time ago now. Are you really telling me that what happened to my grandparents in the 70s would dictate where I wind up in my present life right now? I'm in America. That can't be the case. I'll have some cool numbers to see and show you on that next time. We are gonna end it here. I didn't think we'd have any time to spare, but I'll give it back to you. If you have any questions, go ahead and chime in on chat. Next time, we're gonna have a little more interactivity, but I said this a little during the quiz. I slept through my alarm today. So it's one of those days. Take care of yourselves, guys. Even if it's just resting well, that might be exactly what you should do. So I hope you can do that. Take care. If you're on Zoom and you have questions, just hang tight. You guys can shuffle. Yeah. Mhm. Hi, Julio. I'm going to say the answer just because it's easier than typing. You can turn it in all the way till the end of the semester. I usually process them in batch form. So I have a handful of students who've turned it in, but they haven't heard back yet because I kind of wait a second. So if you want to send it in, you'll probably hear back from me soon, but you can send it in anytime. It's not time sensitive. So if there's any other questions, if not, I'm going to turn the Zoom off, but I see Trinidad and I want to say Carrie, right? Yeah. If you guys have any questions. Okay, thinking none. See you guys next time. Bye. Thank you. You too.